Welcome back to the Rum Ration, the podcast where we explore the human experience of military history, the parts that look great on a monument, and the parts that were mostly mud, paperwork, and someone yelling about the correct angle of a beret or the correct shaping of a beret. I'm Rejoy.
And I'm Colin. And for anyone who's ever worn a beret, you know it's impossible. There is no such thing as a standard for a beret.
Nope.
Yeah. But today we're going to go back in time to Berlin, specifically to July 1945, when the city was still smoking. It was a ruin.
Mm-hmm.
The war is technically over, at least in Europe. There's still fighting going on in Japan, of course. And the Allies decide that what the moment really needs among the specter of human misery and the imminent threat of mass starvation is a victory parade.
Well, of course.
Everybody loves a parade, right?
That's right, Colin. I mean, hey, the war in Europe is over. Let's celebrate the next day. That's essentially what it's all about, right?
Pretty much.
And not just any parade. Now, this one had a Canadian unit that existed basically to march through Berlin and then vanish back into history like a polite ghost.
Sounds like the perfect temporary duty posting.
Yes.
It's called the Canadian Berlin Battalion. And our guest today is the man who wrote the deep dive that brought it out of the shade, Stephen Bright. We were introduced to Stephen by a former honorary colonel of the Royal Montreal Regiment, Andrew Molson. And it's important, Stephen, that we work the RMR into every single one of our episodes.
Every single one.
We're not biased at all.
No, they were there at Cannes, for example.
In spirit.
The antecedents.
But the former honorary colonel of the Royal Montreal Regiment, Andrew Molson, who recommended that we connect because Colonel Andrew was muttering something to me over bites of smoked meat, that geeks of a feather flock together. And he said it would be good for us to connect. And here we are. I think our feathers are gonna flock properly. So our expert guest today, Stephen Bright, began his career in Ottawa back in 1994, working in public affairs for many years before striking out on his own, I should say, in 2011. And today he works on heritage communication projects for a variety of organizations while continuing a long-standing obsession. It's not obsession in a bad way. It's a healthy obsession, we'd like to say, with military history, which we, of course, fully support, and we will absolutely do our best to enable.
100%.
Based in Oakville, Ontario, I should make that clear. Stephen holds degrees from McGill, we won't hold that against him, Western, and the Royal Military College of Canada. And he is currently doing his PhD in history at the University of Edinburgh. Stephen is also a member of the Royal Canadian Military Institute, where I'm also a member, and Rejoy is waiting his hazing ceremony.
Oh, yes, I am waiting my hazing ceremony. I am now. Yes, it's going to be fun.
And Stephen was the inaugural executive director of the Canadian Business History Association. He has since passed the torch to another guest that we've had on the show, Dr. Joanne Archibald, who Stephen introduced us to. Check out episode 38 to learn from Joanne how the 1950s were essentially a strategic blueprint for today. Stephen, welcome to the Rum Ration podcast.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for having me on. It's a real pleasure and an honor. I'd love to dive into the story we're talking about, but let me say to you guys that I love the podcast. Long-time listener, first-time caller kind of thing.
Thank you.
I often listen to it. I've asked other podcast guys I know say, like, what do people do when they're listening to podcasts? For me, it's often taking the GO train into Toronto for meetings or CMI or what have you, which is very appropriate. I'm listening to you guys on the way I'm listening to history on the way into history.
Absolutely.
You know, walks, gardening, what have you. But no, it's a great podcast, and I'm thrilled to be on it.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, we're honored to have you. And when we met up earlier on at the RCMI and just discussing history in general and things to talk about and stuff, you brought up the story of the Canadian Battalion. And I was listening to you talk about it. And I thought, remember, and I said to you, Stephen, this is a great subject for a podcast. And immediately went back, gave Colin a call, and I said, hey, just met up with Stephen. And we were talking about this and it was done. We thought, yes, we've got to tell the story because, you know, it's one of those Canadian stories that's real, meaningful, well documented, and somehow still weirdly unknown, which is, you know, it's basically our brand. It's a story that nobody, and I mean nobody, including myself, before you brought it up, really seems to know anything about. Especially Canadians and, well, Berliners. So how did you stumble upon this incredible story, Stephen?
Well, my wife is has family in Germany, in Berlin in particular, and I've been going there since since 2000 with her. And on the record was a tour of duty with family. You see certain things. Brandenburg Gate, check.
Yep.
Legoland at the time, check.
Yep.
And
Yes.
Sharon's uncle-in-law, I think it may have been a guy named Klaus, who's amazing. He said, "Stephen, I know you like military history. Let's go out." So he and I would we had a boys' night out kind of thing. We hit a few of the museums. We had the tank museum
Mm.
and a few other things. And I think I can't remember the crystalline moment that I came up with this idea or to even investigate it. But I remember thinking, well, either there's an American sector, there's a British sector, there's a French sector for obvious reasons in Berlin. If anyone's been there, and I'm sure we'll get into that. There's no Canadian sector.
No.
And that's not inherently a surprise. But there is this thing called the Allied Museum in Berlin. So I thought, oh, that's just the place. And it's pretty cool. But there's not a single thing about Canada there at all. And again, I can't remember how I thought, well, why isn't there? But then I started to just do a little poke around, and I landed on the Canadian Berlin Battalion. And I thought, well, this, as a writer, I thought this is a great story. And I started to learn about the context, and we'll get into that. And some of your listeners will know some of the military context much better than I do. And apologies in advance if I make any gratuitous factual mistakes. But the parade and the battalion, just for lots of reasons, it's like that seemed to be a great story. There's a story arc. There's a start, there's a middle, there's an end.
Mhm.
As you said, there's documents to it, there's photographs. And I thought, what a great story to tell. And as it turns out, I'm sure other people have told the story, and I've since found a story that someone had written about it from firsthand account, but it's not in the general post-war
Yeah.
narrative. And I thought, well,
Right.
no one's going to write it. Might as well be me.
Yeah, and you mentioned the photos. They're you get to a point if you're a bit of a history geek that you've pretty much seen every picture that's out there, all the standard ones, and so you find something new, you're like, oh my god,
Yeah.
and you get some color ones in there too, because it was at that point in the war where they were actually starting to use color film towards the end of it, and so there's really remarkable photographs in there. And I love personally just the day-to-day mundane activities, not necessarily the stirring stirring images, but just guys like packing up weapons, folding kit, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You got a whole bunch of those really cool photos in there, but it was neat. But before we get into it, I think it's probably a good spot to pause for our beloved by us, at least. I don't know if anyone else likes it, but that's why I said our beloved.
Yes. Yes.
Fantasy sponsor segment. This episode of the Rum Ration podcast is definitely not brought to you by Dominion Participation Port, the fortified wine created specifically for moments when Canada politely clears its throat and says, just to confirm, we'd like it reflected in the minutes that Canada was very much at this meeting.
Notes of dark fruit, oak, and the unmistakable finish of a nation saying, sorry, just confirming we fought the whole war, actually.
That's right. Perfect for toasting years of mud and sacrifice, and the simple truth that Canada didn't cross an ocean just to get thanked in the footnotes.
No, indeed. Dominion Participation Port, because if you don't pour your own toast, everyone else will forget to.
That's for certain. That's for certain. Hollywood certainly forgot Canada.
Oh,
even
yes,
existed.
they did.
Yeah.
We're here to
Stephen,
remind them.
That's
Yes.
right. That's right. Stephen, at the highest level, what are these post-war parades actually for? Beyond the obvious, we won. Why did the powers that be at the time decide to hold one?
Well, that's a great question, and that kind of motivated me a little bit to figure out, they've just been through such a hard's not even the word, incredibly difficult several years. So why then, pop the champagne corks by way of a parade? Obviously, they wanted to celebrate in some ways, but I think what we're seeing is it's a public demonstration of victory and the unconditional surrender that the Allies sought and received. And it really reinforces the years of sacrifice. And you guys were touching on it earlier. To state the obvious, the Canadians were there for a reason. Tim Cook used to refer to World War II as the good war. So it really meant something for the soldiers, or a proxy of the soldiers, because more than 17,000 Canadians died. And that's just the military. So it was is a tangible demonstration of being Canadian, tangible demonstration of the nation of Canada. We can get into what that might mean. But I think at the core of it, it was a couple things. One was, they were the men, and the officers and men were proxy for those who couldn't be there. And I think that's extremely important. And you guys tell me you've both served. And it also sends a message to the Allies that, as you guys were saying, somewhat in jest, but also very seriously, that Canada was there pretty much from day one.
Absolutely.
And just sending the message to everybody with the media there. Colin, you touched on the photos, and I was gobsmacked myself. And shout out, I might add, to the Canadian Military Journal, who sourced some of those photos. And Mike Bechtold, if you're listening, Mike is a phenomenal military historian, and other people who know kind of the literature of photography, if I can put it that way. So the point being that the Canadians, the Allies, the people doing the parade would know, because they invited them, that the world media was there. So Canada wanted to have boots on the ground, and you could see the uniforms and know that Canada was there. And it's very clear that A, the war is over, B, the Allies won, and C, Canada was part of that. And I also think it helps. And we'll get into this maybe in a little bit, like the metaphor, the reality of literally walking, boots on the ground, walking through, Colin, as you said off the top, Berlin, which was a rubble heap. Not the entire city, obviously, but it really marked the transition from the war that just ended, basically yesterday, to whatever the post-war reality might be. Of course, no one really knew what that was, but Canada was asserting the fact that it was kind of like past, present, and future. We were here for a long time. We're now literally here today, and in some way, Canada will be part of the post-world order.
And
Right,
Stephen,
but it wasn't Canada organizing the parade. It was who of the major powers had the idea to get this parade going?
Well, I haven't found a document, the smoking gun, as it were, to say, like, this is what we're going to do. But it was certainly part of the conversation in as early as December 44, with the British, with the Americans, with the Canadians. In December 44, obviously, the war was far from over, and you have the Battle of the Bulge, and things are really quite hot in many, many ways. But, it would, and I'm trying not to look back in time, it would suggest that the war was going to end at some point. And it had to be Berlin if there's going to be a celebration, for obvious reasons. It was the capital city, and that's where Hitler was at the time.
Yeah.
And so a parade would have been an Allied parade. Monty's guys were Montgomery's guys were involved. The Canadians were involved in the planning. So it seemed to be like a multilateral planning session. And as we'll talk about in a sec, that morphed and bobbed and weaved and changed as plans often do. But they're planning this months ahead of time.
Okay. And sorry, and talking of smoking guns, when you describe Berlin, it's literally still smoking, isn't it? I mean,
absolutely, absolutely. It was.
What was it like?
Well, knowing that we were chatting, I found an article here, December 10th, or sorry, 10 May, 1945. So really 2 days after the signing. Matthew Halton, a name that many Canadians will know, very famous Canadian journalist,
CBC journalist, right?
CBC journalist, radio and print. And father of David Halton, some people will remember that. Anyway, and I know, as a journalist myself, former journalist, I know journalists don't write the headlines, but the headline struck. Here I'm reading here, if I may, as Carney would say, if I may, destruction of Berlin so complete that city may never be repaired.
Ooh.
And so it was bombed out in many, many ways. As you say, I'm sure if smoke wasn't in the air, you certainly would have smelt it. Buildings were destroyed and were destroyed for decades later. Potsdamplatz, for example, parts of that, from my understanding, weren't rebuilt until the 90s.
Yeah.
There were bullet holes in buildings. There were, as you would see in many cities, Rejoy, your German experience, you would say as well, like it's just, the visual scars were there. The aerial bombardment flattened it. It was,
and they've still kept one, haven't they? I think it's on the Kurfürstendamm, the remnants of I think it's the Kaiserliche Kirche, one of the churches. Which they've not rebuilt. They've left the smoldering bricks, which are still in place. It when you walk past that, it really hits you.
Reminder. Yeah,
it's amazing. And my German's not great, but I believe it correct me if I'm wrong, I think it refers to hollow tooth or hollow shell. So exactly. So that's still there. And at the same time, and off script a wee bit, but Dresden, who obviously flattened as well, they rebuilt that exactly. So the burden of history sits very, very heavily on Berlin specifically, on the Germans generally, from what I can see from my family there. And of course, I wasn't there, but you can see it. And at the time in 45, it would have been absolutely brutal because, among other things, just horrifically, almost 45,000 people died,
Mm.
Germans,
Wow.
just in the war, just in the month of April. And that's about 22,000 civilians and about 22,000 plus or minus German soldiers. So that last month leading up to, again, we know what happened, but they didn't know at the time. Leading up to it, it was rapacious, it was destructive. The suicide rate soared. It would have been hell on earth by the time the Canadians came a little bit later.
Yeah, it would have been a true Dante's Inferno, and we'll
Yeah.
probably
Yeah.
get into
Yeah.
later. I was about to make a cheeky remark before when we were talking about the planning and who's involved, and I was going to say, were the Soviets actually going to be able to take a break from their busy schedule of mass rape and
Yeah.
looting and
Pillaging
taking
and
everything that's
yeah.
going on and pillaging? But I think it's overlooked, and understandably, because it's hard to have sympathy in a way for a population that was willingly and cheering on the Nazi government and all that good stuff. And it was great times in the 30s, and then careful what you wish for because it comes back upon you. But boy, oh boy, did vengeance ever get wreaked on the Berlin and just
Yes,
completely
Well,
pounded the
absolutely.
well,
place
well,
there.
the irony of that also is that Berlin was the most anti-Nazi
Yeah, absolutely.
city in
Yeah.
Germany, which is quite incredible. Munich was all in,
Munich. Yeah.
and the South were all in.
Yeah.
But the North, they didn't really, like the Nazis very much. And Berlin was a very liberal, artsy
Hmm.
city in the 20s and the
In the
30s.
20s. Yeah. Yep.
And they paid arguably the heaviest price of all the, well, Dresden, of course, was flattened completely and
Yeah.
nothing remained. But they paid a very, very heavy price for
Mm.
what the Nazis did. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So back to Berlin itself. Why is
Mhm.
Canada there?
Mm.
Especially, we didn't fight our way into Berlin as an army.
No, no, we didn't. And we'll talk in a second about the first Canadians who touched ground in Berlin. They were attached to this story, but I think part of it, and we've touched on a little bit here, is that Canada's presence there was about national participation. Um, it's visible sign that, as I say, we were there, and in a July 45 context, we are here. And here being Berlin, because that was the chosen spot
Mm-hmm.
for this parade for reasons we've touched on. And again, I've used the word proxy, and I don't want to overuse the word, but I think in many ways it was a proxy for the fact that they came across Normandy, they came up Italy, they came across the Scheldt. There was other campaigns leading up to what became the victory, but as I say, they didn't know that at the time.
Yeah.
So that was brutal, and you guys will know well, your beloved RMR and others, like they were really in the thick of it. And now, um, as you say, Colin, we didn't fight in Berlin. The Soviets came screaming in from the east on the ground, and then the West kind of, or the Allies kind of came from the west in the air. Canada wasn't part of that, but that was the place to represent Canadian troops. That was represent the casualty count, which
Mm-hmm.
my apologies if I get the number wrong, but I think it was 17,682 Canadians who were killed during hostilities. And
Just the ground
yeah,
forces.
yeah, no, indeed, yeah, exactly. And then again, is this public statement that we had earned a right from day one. Let's remind ourselves,
Hmm.
we had earned a right to be part of the victory, however that was defined and expressed, and the victory narrative. And this is very much part of the narrative, because let's face it, a parade of this variety, there's no tactical strategic reason. And you guys tell me this, you guys are army guys, but the reason was specifically for what we would call photo ops, or something like that. So there's incredible symbolic to it, but they didn't have to do this, but
Yeah.
they collectively, the Allies and the Soviets were there. They chose to do this for lots of different reasons. And it also, as a reminder, kind of flip side that story, Canada was in no way, shape, or form on the sidelines to any of this action. We're in different theaters of war. I've written as well the Canadian deployment to Iceland as of
Mm-hmm.
June
Right.
1940. So the Canadians, and obviously the Pacific theater and so on, which at this time was still happening. But I think, yeah, it's just showing that Canada was central, albeit arithmetically in smaller numbers, but Canada was a smaller country. But we were
Of course.
part of this thing from day one.
And the good thing about this, or the really interesting thing about it is it feels very Canadian, doesn't it? In the sense that who Canada chooses to represent the country
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
this parade. It's not just, you know, some random troops. Okay, you're free. So you send a battalion, whoever it is. You've got a real French Canadian presence in this mix. Most obviously, the Fusilier Montreal, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And my McGill French teacher would weep when I, if I were to read aloud uh, some of the French diaries, not because of of what was written, but because of my accent. It is incredible that, yeah, that Fusilier are there. And I don't mean incredulous. I mean, it's amazing that they're there.
Yeah,
And, of course, they were part of Dieppe. They're
yeah,
incredibly storied. You guys are from Montreal. You'll know that story
Well, they're a
better than better.
founding regiment
Mhm.
of the Royal Montreal Regiment. It needs to be pointed out, of course, to mention the
Yes,
RMR.
yes.
The
So we were also
FMR
there.
at the time was known as the
I thought I'd tee that
65e.
up for you. That was
There you go. Thank you. The 65e Carabinieri de Montréal at the time. Yeah.
you can send me my free hat in the mail after that. After that, for that one. But it's no, it is amazing. And when we were talk about the numbers and so on, yeah, this was not well, the Canadians who were represented in the battalion weren't token in their
Yeah.
own regiments. They were there in significant numbers. And as you
Yeah.
say, Rejoy, the one of the first and certainly the biggest in terms of headcount, if I can put it that way, were French Canadians from Montreal.
I find it kind of interesting that there was only 3 units chosen, because I'm thinking back to to nowadays when we're doing a big 100th
Mhm.
anniversary of Vimy or some significant anniversary, the 80th anniversary of Normandy landings. Typically, Canada is now sending smaller contingents, obviously, because it's a lot more expensive to send them from Canada, but
Yeah.
they're sending a couple of members of every unit that
Mm.
participated in there. So I'm kind of surprised that, I'm thinking about it, like reflecting upon this, is that why didn't they send like a section from each battalion and every, engineering regiment and everything? It's interesting that they just chose to do 3 different infantry units. I mean, we have one from West and Central Canada and one from Quebec, but yeah, it's kind of cool. So it's almost like this parade unit is doing nation building on the march, as we were. What I find also interesting, it doesn't feel like, because you're going to get into it later, that it
Yeah.
seems politically, at least from the prime minister level, there was a complete absence of give a fuck, I guess would be the appropriate term. But
To coin a phrase.
so it doesn't feel like a DEI initiative being shoved down the throats of the forces. It seems like the forces just kind of did this naturally, the armed forces, that doing some nation building.
Well, nothing says unity like coordinating accents at 120 steps a minute. So, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But you also frame your article, Stephen, about it's almost like a signal to the future, almost like
Mm.
Canada saying, "Hey, we're here. We were here from the beginning. We're here at the end.
Mhm.
We want to say in the post-war order, right?"
Yeah.
No, very much so, and I think that there are different layers to that because the Canadians obviously from a fighting perspective at the sharp end of the spear in many ways, as we've talked about and as your listeners and viewers will know very, very well. But Canada was also heavily involved in the political side of the post-war order. Again, they didn't know what that was going to look like, but the discussions about what created the United Nations, as an
Mhm.
example. Canada was central to that. The Potsdam Conference, which was happening 30 kilometers or so away from the parade, we weren't in the room. The Canadians weren't in the room, but nor was Canada in the room in many other things. But while the politicians were in Potsdam talking about the post-war world, whatever that might be, the Canadians were. The Canadian military was in Berlin, so there's kind of an interesting dichotomy there. So it's not surprising that the Canadians weren't at Potsdam. I'm sure we had people, observers. But yeah, I think, Rejoy, to your point, it speaks to Canada's ambitions to say that this, the war is over, but that's not the end of our participation. There are other different ways that Canada could, should, and would, participate. And your podcast with Dr. Joanne Archibald, you mentioned that off the top. She speaks very poignantly to the early Cold War period.
Mhm.
Again, I'm looking at history in reverse here, but clearly that what's happening in 45 augurs in some ways what's going to be happening.
Yeah.
And so Canada is participating on the ground. As we say, it's really only an hour or so in the parade itself. But I do think it's sending a much broader message.
Yeah.
Canada's part of
Yeah.
an allied partner in whatever is going to be coming. We didn't just fold up our tent and go home. We were
Right.
very much involved.
So Newton, my controversial cat, has just weighed in and takes exception to your pronunciation of Potsdam.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well,
so we have a proper pronunciation given behind me. But interestingly enough, I'm listening to an audiobook, James Holland's Normandy 44,
Mhm.
where he talks about the Canadians consistently punching above their weight.
Mm.
And that was in the early days of Normandy. So I think it sort of reinforces the point that that Canada had earned a seat at the table.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. This was not a token gesture. Okay, fellas, let's plan this parade. Oh, and like tap on the shoulder. What about the Canadians? Like it was, I think it was probably central to say that they should be there in some way. And by the way, they're also kind of nice. But yeah, no, I think it was a very natural thing to do, and no evidence have I seen. And you're mentioning Holland there. There's no evidence to suggest that they got a seat at the adults table because they knew somebody. It was because they earned their right to be there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that decision to have this parade and to do all the reordering the new, the world order, I guess, came earlier than I guess a lot of people would think. It didn't just happen right after the final victory in May.
Yeah.
It was quite a bit before the war ended, right?
No, exactly. And so in December 44, as I mentioned a little bit, they being Mackenzie King and his government start planning this, which was natural for them to do. So my master's thesis at RMC was about the Committee on Reconstruction for World War II, which Mackenzie King and the so-called mandarins, the people who are deputy ministers and so on, they had some of their first meetings, what became the Committee on Reconstruction, in October 1939.
Oh, wow.
And so you kind of think about, okay, well, October 1939, some people still call it the phony war. Like they weren't even really sure what's happening. My point simply
Canadian
is that
troops hadn't even deployed yet.
no, exactly.
The RMR,
And I
of
think,
course, was part of the first contingent that went over. We have to mention that. And
of course, you took the words out of my
December.
mouth, Colin. I couldn't have said it better myself. So
Shameless. I am absolutely shameless.
are you keeping a tab? Like how many RMR?
I have to take a shot of rum this time.
There's a lot coming.
Yeah, you have to mention it at least 12 times before this podcast goes to air.
We were the advance party for the
absolutely
for the phony war and also for the invasion, but that's little known.
There you go. And also just a little bit of context as well. Not that I'm an expert on World War I, but it seems that when World War I ended, there was no post-war strategy of any
Didn't
note.
feel like there was a plan.
No, exactly. So, lesson learned, as they say, and I don't want to sound facetious because obviously that was an extraordinarily challenging time. But I think, so in other words, post-war planning came naturally to Mackenzie King and his government. They obviously didn't do it flawlessly. Nobody did. But back to the point. So in December 44, they start having this, Mackenzie King has this idea, okay, he's going to approve Canadian participation in the anticipated, and I think anticipated is a key word because, of course, they didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know who was going to, the race to Berlin, right? Like who's going to get there first? Turns out the Soviets got there first. But in December 44, Mackenzie King approves participation, and then the planning starts to morph and change and so on. And in January, there's a top secret memo that the Canadians sent to the British to say, basically, we're in. And then the participation was contingent on, I know this sounds very obvious, but obviously this was an important thing to say. It was contingent on Germany being defeated. This war has to end first. And then,
because it's touch and go. It could go either way at that point.
Yes.
Well, you don't know, right? Like you have
he's got those wonder weapons he's working on. You never know.
No, B2, never heard of it.
You can see the stereotypical Field Marshal Blimp back in London saying, "Hey, we'll walk through anyway. Got the parade plan. Catering has been confirmed. The Germans are free to attend if they'd like to."
Exactly. G&T's at noon, regardless.
Exactly. Cucumber sandwiches will be served.
So, and that was, and obviously Berlin as an asset, as a prize, the city, and I mean that in a tactical, strategic, operational, political way. Like there's lots of different levels why Berlin was a prize, certainly in 44.
Yeah.
And then again, not really knowing what's going to happen, Mackenzie King and his government just basically put up their hand, if I can put it that way, and say,
Yeah.
like, we are going to be there in some way, shape, or form once this thing is done, but let's get on with winning the war.
But Stephen, the interesting thing here is, and you make that point in your article. So Mackenzie King signs off on it, says, all good, we are definitely going to be there, and then basically forgets about it, ignores the Berlin Battalion completely afterwards. There's no mention of them.
So if anyone's ever looked at the Mackenzie King diaries, and they're available online and digitized, and some that you can read in handwriting and so on, he wrote everything for decades, right? And references to dead dogs and seances and so on are legendary. But if you do look in the archive, in the diary rather itself, he's dealing with a lot. He references a lot of fairly specific things.
He was very close to his mother.
No, exactly. And there's these are fascinating. There's books been written about the diary itself. Yes. And so anyway, so it was natural for me as a historian, let's check out the diary, see if he said anything. And he was born in Berlin, which became Kitchener.
Yeah.
So when I looked through, the days this was happening, there's nothing there. I wasn't inherently surprised that there was nothing there, but I thought maybe, given the relevance we're talking about and so on, he might give a nod. Oh, and by the way, the boys walked in Berlin. There's nothing there. But again, I don't want to overplay that absence, but it was notable. So I thought I would mention that. And that might be one of the reasons why the parade, and I don't want to oversell the parade in the context of things happening, as we said, Potsdam and some big things are happening. But this parade, which did attract the national and international media, was important. And so Mackenzie King, if I can put it this way, ignoring it might be one of the reasons why the story wasn't that well known at certain levels. Although, the headlines, certainly in the hometowns of the regiments, they were very proud of their boys going over. And there's story after story after story in July 45 about, who's over there, the pace, the pipers, all that kind of stuff. And then it just kind of gets eclipsed by events, is often the case in history, I guess.
But it's funny, having the Prime Minister just ignore it after signing off on the whole reconstruction and being participated. It's about the most definitive passive aggressively Canadian way to just kind of miss the point.
Classic. It's absolutely classic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So before we get to the battalion, you begin earlier, like with about the two Canadians. We were discussing that a little bit earlier. The two Canadians who, well, technically beat everyone else to Berlin.
Yeah, I think this is incredible. The opening is almost cinematic. You got a pair of Canadians escorting senior German officials to sign the surrender. I can absolutely see Brad Pitt playing the parts. He has a thing for World War II hero movies.
Yeah, exactly. And if I were a casting agent, that's exactly what I'd be thinking about in reading the story. So basically, and I've taken what I'm about to say from different articles, a couple journals, and first-hand accounts by one of the guys, and it happens to be the Flight Lieutenant Mike Carmichael and Sergeant Larry Pincombe, and they're both part of the RCAF Service Police Unit, which is attached to the 2nd Tactical Air Force. And on 7 May 45, they're given orders to escort, quote, 6 important German officials to Berlin for the purpose of signing, quote, the unconditional surrender. So obviously it is a big deal, but 6 important German. Okay, all right, fine. And Carmichael is a former RCMP. Pincombe is a former cop. Well, I shouldn't say former. They perhaps kind of. I honestly, I don't know what they did post-war, but this was their background. Was so escorting people would not have been inherently novel to them, and they're kind of teed up. Okay, chaps, you've got these 6 guys you've got to take on escort.
Now, this is the best part. The Germans are late because they are celebrating. So the two things here that strike me is A, this is the enemy. They're celebrating. And B, Germans are never late. I mean, you know this, I know this, like they are always punctual. Now and this is the military. They're late.
No, exactly. Like 5 minutes early is on time is late. And one of my German relatives, when we were planning a trip in Germany, he was asking me the timetable of my travel.
Yes.
And he was crestfallen, if not morally offended, that we didn't have a specific. Stephen, what time will you have lunch? I don't know. and wonderful man, like very colorful, but to the point, as you're saying, there is certainly a well-earned stereotype of punctuality. So, in reading this thing, you're celebrating. Is that the word? Maybe it is the word. I think these 6, important Germans kind of knew what they knew that the gig was up, like the war was over. And they're being sent off to their fate, whatever their fate may be. So if word celebrating is one that captures it, so be it. But they were apparently extraordinarily hungover the next morning.
Just tell us, who were these guys?
Well, here we go.
It's pretty serious cast of characters here.
Yeah.
No, exactly. So for listeners and viewers out there, start thinking about who might play these roles. So we have, and apologies in advance, I will probably butcher the pronunciation, and my family in Berlin will never speak to me again. But these are no slouches. You have Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, who's the chief of the Armed Forces High Command.
Yes.
You have Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg, who's the commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, and General Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, who's the chief of the general staff of the Luftwaffe, plus their aide-de-camp. So like these are like top
head of the Navy,
pyramid.
head of the Air Force, and head of the combined total air forces.
Yes.
It's pretty impressive.
Yes.
This
Not just Corporal Joe Blow.
This is kind of like a power trio of people that these 2 Canadians are now. Okay, by the way, lads, you're taking these guys, and so okay. And I honestly don't know. It'd be great to find out. Maybe I should have in advance of this. I don't know if the 2 Canadians in our story knew who these guys were necessarily. They would have recognized they're very senior, of course. Yeah. But I'm not sure if they literally knew who they were. But in any event, obviously, the contracts of, kind of some modest Canadians doing their job, and senior Nazi leadership arriving to surrender the documents, hungover, no less. It just seemed to me. Thank you for picking up on that. I thought, as a writer,
Loved it.
This part almost wrote itself.
Loved that. Oh, well, as soon as you said they were late, that's what caught my attention.
That alone was a sign.
Wait a minute.
and Keitel was head of state by that point, wasn't he? Because Goering had been fired by Hitler before he killed himself. Himmler was out of contention. So it was Keitel who took over. Is that not true?
No.
I think so.
No?
And I think Dönitz from the
Dönitz.
Then
Right.
kind of
Sorry, Dönitz, and then Keitel would have been under Dönitz. Yeah.
So then there's almost like a post-battlefield promotion
yes,
here.
Correct.
And then here are the 3 guys being bundled into a plane with a couple of friendly Canadians, and okay, here we go.
Yeah. Make sure you strap in.
Strap in. With your hangover.
Get your seatbelt attached. Yeah.
That's right.
It's a very grim comedy, really. It's the end of the Third Reich, brought to you by administrative humiliation and a hangover.
Yeah, exactly. To boot. Yeah, exactly. Schnapps, no doubt. Yeah.
Indeed. Well, we laugh, but it's also the sound of a regime collapsing, isn't it? I mean, it's less Wagner and more aspirin, really.
Yeah. Put on a soundtrack and post-production, Colin, to this. This would be, the Ride of the Valkyries is like, whatever, not Ride of the, but you know what I mean. Like,
and then have it wind down into a like,
yeah. All right. Let's rein this back in here. Let's get to the parade unit itself. The Berlin Brigade idea comes first, right? It wasn't necessarily a battalion. It was going to be a brigade.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that was commensurate with the ambitions of the Allies to have they're about to win a big war, so let's have a big parade.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So, in 13 May of 45, it was publicly announced that there's going to be brigade size, and so obviously that's bigger than a battalion, and it was calling
for civilians who are listening. That's about 5,000 people versus a battalion is upwards to 1,000.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, for context, it is materially larger, and it was meant to include a broad representation, not just the infantry, but supporting arms and services, artillery, engineers, armor, admin, auxiliary elements, and as you say, like the numbers I saw, plus or minus 250 officers, just south of 5,000 other ranks. So in the ballpark in the planning was around 5,200.
And do you know if any signalers would have been included? Because we have a certain Master Warrant Officer, Sarah Anvari, who takes exception if the signals are left out. We've had some rather pointed feedback.
Yes, that is true.
I'm going to stay out of that one.
Oh, so you've met her.
That was a strategic withdrawal if I ever heard one.
Thank you. Yeah.
So I can see, like, when these numbers are being presented, I can see the bean counters kind of going, what? You're like, what? That's a lot of
Yeah.
Canadians to feed, move, and most importantly, keep from liberating souvenirs.
Another great word. You've talked about celebrating and liberating.
Yeah.
No, I think that's right, and I think that the sheer size and everything that comes with that lends itself to someone panicking, either in Whitehall in London or
Yeah.
in Parliament Hill in Ottawa, saying this is just, we can't. This is way too big, and
Yeah.
there's among other reasons, there would have been a constellation of reasons, but among other reasons is the infrastructure of Berlin, as we started to off the top,
Right.
Yeah.
was decimated. So the prospect of moving thousands, no doubt, of vehicles, thousands of people in and out of a city and feeding them and clothing them
Fueling the
and
vehicles
everything
and
else,
all that stuff. Yeah.
no way. Like you, I don't care how big your ambitions are for a parade, it just
Yeah.
physically won't happen. So they downgrade from this kind of brigade idea, despite the ambitions that were attached to that. Say, okay, that ain't going to work. So I don't want to use the word downgrade, but I simply mean that from a planning perspective. And then they kind of whittle it down to something that's a bit more manageable of size. And the units that were otherwise attached to the brigade were instructed to rejoin their respective brigades and divisions. And then, it seems, look at a few of the diaries, some of the people who would have been involved didn't seem to be overly upset that they weren't involved. Like, oh, well, I kind of, like, some may have wanted to go, but the fact that it was downsized was not inherently surprising for the reasons we talked about, because those are the guys on the ground who kind of knew, like, it ain't going to happen. So
Yeah. They had other things to worry about. Yeah.
Yeah, so the brigade size gets downgraded. Signals would have been sent back to their duties. Just point that out, Sarah. It's not that they hadn't been overlooked.
Shout out to signals.
But then the concept comes back, but smaller, right?
Yeah, exactly. So now we have something that is, as you said, it's very helpful context. Roughly 5,000 to roughly 1,000, and then the commensurate number of tanks and vehicles and so on shrinks. It's still a sizable
Sure.
contingent in many ways, but I think for practical reasons, a single battalion was really the size, but the symbolism never changes. The symbolism of Canadian feet, boots on the ground, vehicles on the ground, what have you, that is always the core organizing idea, if you will, or ambition, in the way this is going to express itself.
Yeah.
But just the sheer number shrinks down a bit.
Yeah, so this is
for
far,
people
far
who like
more
doing
manageable,
math. Just think, it's 20 to 30 soldiers maximum to one vehicle, and they're really squished in there. So that's a lot of trucks. It's a lot of fuel going into a place that has no infrastructure whatsoever to be able to support that.
Yeah.
That's a very good point, Colin. I hadn't even imagined that. That's right. Like squeezing the soldiers into transport. So this is it's a classic military pivot, right? Well, we can't send a brigade, but you know what? We can send a battalion, and that battalion will march like it's being judged, like a brigade.
So, Stephen, how is a battalion formed?
So it was a composite battalion, and as we've touched on a little bit, composite in the sense it was drawn from different regiments, and specifically draws from 1st Canadian Division, 2nd Canadian Division, and 4th Canadian Division, and notably 3rd Canadian Infantry Division was already organized in the Canadian Army Occupation Force. So they were already doing what they're excuse me, what they were doing. And so if you're looking for a pan-Canadian proxy, you're going to pick from the other 3 divisions.
Right.
And then now that we collectively now know it's battalion size, they just scale it appropriately. And they pick as a guy to head it, wonderfully named in some ways, Lieutenant Colonel A.F. Coffin of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. And he was like everyone had a pre-world life. In his case, he was a pharmacist from Medicine Hat.
That's gives you pause for thought, right? If your pharmacist is named Coffin.
Or your
It's like
CO.
seeing a dead plant in the doctor's office.
Yes.
You do kind of wonder. Yeah.
We know where you're going to end up. But
Exactly.
but I love that. I mean, a pharmacist in charge of this, because nothing says victory parade quite like a man who can also recommend something for your trench cough.
Multi-purpose.
Absolutely.
Multi-purpose indeed.
But we're gonna get into, I guess, how big this composite unit is. And in the early plan, you actually name the infantry units, and one of them, of course, being the Fusilier Royal, which puts a pretty distinct French-Canadian stamp on the whole thing. And because we at the Rum Ration podcast are advocates for recognizing,
Yes.
quite frankly, the often overlooked French-Canadian participation, Don Cherry, check out our 3-part series, which is spread through episodes 32, 36, and 37 of the Rum Ration podcast. So, Stephen, weren't the Fusiliers the largest number of all the troops in the Canadian Berlin Battalion?
Yeah, they were, and I saw nothing makes the historian's heart leap, or at least this historian's heart pound quite as much as finding a good table, and
Yes.
numbers and so on. As I taught,
Columns, rows, so soothing.
Well, as I learned as a young chap at McGill, don't be afraid of numbers, as one of my history profs told me. So anyway, when I found a table and then I started to pull together, very easy math, but for me, this is sophisticated stuff. So the Fusilier they provide 320 of the other ranks, as it were. Let me kind of start out. So there are 42 officers.
Mm-hmm.
There's about 800 or about 900 other ranks. So we're looking at roughly 930 total personnel. And there's the three composite pieces. There's the Argylls, the Fusilier, and the Loyal Edmonton Regiment. So Fusilier are 320, and I know it's hard to visualize numbers by the ear as a speechwriter. I'm breaking my own rules here, but so it's about 36% of the other ranks are the Fusilier. For context, the Argylls provide about 26%, and the Loyal Edmontons about 29%. And in terms of the officers, the Argylls have the most, again, smaller subset, but percentage-wise, the Argylls, not surprisingly, given Coffin is there. So in other words, I could throw out numbers all day, but just the Fusiliers were indeed, Colin, to your point, the largest representation.
So the Argylls were tasked with providing the command structure and the administrative structure for it.
Yes.
And so the Loyal Eddies and the FMR were just providing troops.
And that led to a little bit of, the next problem. Marching pace politics.
Well,
it's one of the most Canadian operational crises imaginable. And any of us who have ever had to deal with grumpy old senior NCOs, we could see where this is going.
That's how I lost my hair.
Can you, Stephen, can you walk the uninitiated through, perhaps? Get that
walking through it, the operative verb there. So exactly. You've got 3 regiments, all with their own histories, their own kind of MO, if you will, obviously under Canadian ethos, but there are variances. The Argylls, for example, their marching pace was 110 steps per minute. The Edmontons were rather crisper, 140, and our Montreal friends, the Fusiliers, 125 steps per minute. And Colin, as you said initially, in terms of overall head count, there are more French Canadians there than anyone else. So after, it would have been, I don't know if this was a 2-minute conversation or a 3-hour meeting. Obviously, I wasn't in the room, but it would have been interesting to figure out, to have heard the discussions. But in the end, they landed on 125 per minute, and that kind of became, if you will, a compromise, not for them because that was their standard, but compromise for the guys who were a little bit slower or a little bit faster. And obviously, there's a real, you guys would tell me, there's a real practicality to this because you can't have guys in a parade marching at different paces. So they
you can, and it sucks. It's probably 120 just to correct, because we will get complaints.
Yes, we
probably
will.
120 beat per minute. But every year when you have, like in Montreal, and I'm sure in Toronto, the same thing, you have these Remembrance Day parades when you have massed composite units being formed, and so everyone's following one of the bands, and then the band, like if you have a brass band and they're doing crisp 120, and then it hands over to the pipe band, who then drops it down to below 110, and everyone's trying to marching it. It's not fun to try to get the step and keep cadence, and it feels, if you're used to, like Rejoy and I grew up in 120 beats per minute, and then you're suddenly going at the Highland pace, it feels weird. weird. It feels like an out of body experience.
Yeah.
As you're marching. Then you get used to it, of course, and then of course the brass band takes over. Then you got to go back. So
Yeah,
kind of crazy.
because you fall into that cadence, right? And all of a sudden the cadence switches. So we have post-war unity, but first we need to settle that step per minute dispute like civilized people.
That's right.
Which was done with compromise, as you said, Stephen. They decided what they were going to do, and of course, then you've got the simmering resentment, which will always be there.
Absolutely.
Should have gone with what we normally do, because that whole 120 thing is no good. So
yeah. So Stephen, when do they move to Berlin?
So the movement orders came at the end of June, and there's an advance party of about 25 people, all ranks, that leave Braunschweig at nice and early in the morning, about 5 a.m. on 2nd July, and then the main body of what is now the Canadian Berlin Battalion, and I believe it was called that like formally by this point, both formally and informally. So the main body of the battalion showed up 2 days later, rather. Coffin and colleagues were there in situ, and another kind of moment, Hollywood moment, almost in a sense of, is when they arrived. They saw the Union Jack was being unfurled over the Charlottenburger Chaussee, which is anyone who is in Berlin. I confess I don't know if it's still called that to this day, but it's from kind of like the Siegersäule to the Brandenburg Gate. So to again talk about symbolism and expressions of Allied participation and victory and so on, to see, and of course Canada didn't have the flag we know now at the time, but to see that flag unfurled down this significant avenue must have been incredibly symbolic for everybody involved, including there were a number of German citizens, civilians, who came out of their incredibly difficult circumstances wherever they were living and so on. They came to check out the parade route.
And just for those people who don't know Berlin, the Siegersäule is that victory column, where you have the symbol of victory, and that leads right to the Brandenburger Tor. And the thing about the battalion is, at first they don't really know their role, do they?
No, and you tell me.
Great.
This is
pretty standard.
Probably not surprising.
Very standard. Very standard.
Hurry up and wait.
Yes.
So they get there, and when I say they, now I'm referring to the group of more or less 1,000 people, Canadians. So they're moving and they get set up. It's apparent to many of them that they know, obviously, they're going to be doing a parade and the symbolism and so on that attaches to that. But they're also aware that the Potsdam conference, which we mentioned a bit earlier, is down the road, and I mean that quite literally. If you know Berlin, it's really not that far away, down one of the main roads. And that conference is starting on 17 July, and there'll be people listening to you and who are absolute experts on the Potsdam conference. And I won't suggest I am in any way, shape, or form, but simply that the head of the victorious countries are plotting. Not plotting in a negative way, but planning what the next world order is going to look like from a geopolitical perspective. And you have all the top dogs are down the street. So the Canadians know that Potsdam is happening. They know they're part of a parade, but kind of day to day, I'm not sure some of them really knew, what to do.
So they're playing sports in the Olympic Stadium.
Well, yeah, when when in doubt, pull out the baseball bat.
Exactly.
And,
yeah there you are.
And so people will remember the 36 Olympics in Berlin and Olympic Stadium and Jesse Owens and all that was attached to that. So there's incredible symbolism for many, many, many reasons, for doing something in Olympic Stadium, not least of which, and I don't want to underplay it, I'm sure they had stuff to do, but they weren't rigorous, 20-hour days. So, so they were running around the field playing baseball with the Americans. And apparently the Americans won a game. We won a game. All right, lads, this is, and obviously sport is part of military history. People are playing soccer and so that was not inherently surprising perhaps, but the venue itself, like, my goodness, now you're playing baseball in Olympic, that'll show you, like, we're playing an American game, I guess, in
Yes.
Olympic Stadium while
Yes.
planning is going on. But it was
Yes.
incredibly symbolic. I'm not sure the guy playing third base really thought about this is, oh my God, it's symbolic. He just wanted to catch the ball.
Well,
But
we'd
the
like to
fact
think
is,
that
it
because of
was,
the bitterness of the 1936 Olympics, which we covered in episode 40 about the 1948 Olympics, the RCAF Flyers had won the gold.
Yes.
You know, they've
Yes.
been still smarting from the 36 Winter Olympics when
Yes.
Canada was beaten by the dastardly British who had poached a whole bunch of top talent from Canada to bring them over. So maybe they were thinking that when they were throwing the ball around with the Yanks.
yeah.
And they carry on that tradition with the Eurovision contest, don't they?
So there you go.
Poaching talent. But, you know, nothing says the war is over like playing baseball in the stadium built to impress the world in 1936, only 9 years earlier. Well,
Exactly. It's very, very, very recent.
yeah, history is not subtle at all, is
No,
it?
not subtle at all.
No.
And so then we don't just march off into a parade. Every soldier's had to suffer through this. There's lots of rehearsals that are done. Nothing like getting ready for the rehearsal for the rehearsal for the rehearsal. So could you tell us about how they were doing the rehearsals and preparations?
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, you want to plan this because this is going to be quite a big deal. The date was chosen to be Saturday, July 21st. And so prior to that, they're doing rehearsal, as you say. And by that, there's about 2,000 people in the end in the parade that we're talking about. And I was kind of astonished. I found somewhere in the archives 417 freshly painted vehicles. Now, the vehicles weren't new, but they're freshly painted, and in various states of repair, I suspect. But
Or as they say in the military, now they're new.
That's right.
yeah, it's like it was like dialing back the odometer or something. Hey, look, it's new. So they obviously wanted to look smart, and have the, in almost, and I don't want to sound facetious, but in some ways, when you're painting something, you're kind of covering over the scars, and you wanted to show like, we are here, we won, this is our thing. So, but they practice for a while. Apparently, it didn't go well. Surprise, surprise. When you're involving a bunch of different people, and as you say, different
to be
marching
fair,
paces.
the troops hadn't exactly been practicing drill for the last 6
Yeah,
months.
no, exactly. Especially this, we're now at a new pace. Like that alone would have thrown some people off. So they do tech rehearsal, if you will, and they're all given ribbons to look sharp, look smart, and I have to think that they were. I don't know if I could ever prove this, but they're among the first Canadians to be in a victory parade. Obviously, the first time doing this kind of parade, clearly, but a victory parade of any particular note. There would have been others, I realize, but
you wouldn't want me to bring up the RMR in 1918 as they cross over the Rhine, right? The first Canadian unit to do so, and they're being reviewed. We wouldn't want to bring that up.
No. Just because we're shy of our 12 mentioned quotient. I think we're getting close, Colin.
We're getting there.
Fire away, as they say. It's your podcast. I'm just the humble guest, but I'm sure there's room for at least 3 more gratuitous mentions of RMR.
We'll find them. And their drill was not sloppy at all. And just to let you know. But so basically here we have campaign decorations have been issued. You may now wear the ribbons. Please do not walk like a sack of potatoes.
That's right.
Which you might do if you were to sample some of our fantasy sponsors' product.
That's right, Rejoy, because it's time for another fantasy sponsor break. This episode is definitely not brought to you by Charlottenburger Chaussee Champagne for victory parades where the war is over, but the marching standards are somehow stricter.
Yes, notes of green apple, cold steel, and that special post-war flavor. Smile for the camera, you're representing the Dominion.
Pairs well with freshly issued ribbons and the quiet terror of realizing that your left foot is now a matter of foreign policy.
Oh, indeed. Charlottenburger Chaussee Champagne, because peace is here, but it still wants you in step.
That's right.
Fantastic. I'll put in my order right now for 12 bottles.
So, Stephen, parade day. What's the mood?
Yeah. Okay. Game day.
Yeah.
So again, from the contemporary diaries, it seems very optimistic. Weather was cool and clear. Again, reminding people this is 21 July, so it's probably going to be getting hot later. But the morning seemed to dawn quite well. The troops appeared to be in fairly excellent spirits. There's a soldierly optimism, and I suspect it also, frankly, let's get this thing done. And then get on to whatever we're doing, because clearly people wanted to go home. by this point. By home, I mean come back to Canada.
Yes. Yes.
And this was in some ways a great honor, but in other ways, it's yet another thing to do before I go home.
Yeah.
So I was reading a little bit of, inherent sincere pride that they're part of this incredible symbolic show, but also like, come on, fellas, like let's get her done, as my father-in-law would say. So there's a sense of anticipation, pride, but also I think some sense when it's over, some sense of relief.
Yeah, because let's not forget that the week that they've been there, they had the inspection on the 13th. Well, I can assure you that that was one of many, many, many inspections, as
No
every
doubt,
level
yeah.
of NCO went through the troops and made them re-iron, polish their boots, get their beret, polish all the brass on their cap badges, on and on and on and on. You said repainted those vehicles. They didn't send them in. I bet you they repainted them themselves.
Exactly.
So they had to take everything out. They had to paint them, put everything back in. It was probably criticized by some NCO. They had to do it again. I bet you they had to wash and
Missed a spot.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, so for the soldiers, it dawns cool and clear in the morning, and they're like, "Thank God, soon this will be done."
Yeah, and like you said earlier, Colin, I mean, let's not forget on top of all of that, you've got the rehearsals of the rehearsals of the rehearsals of the rehearsals, right? So happiness is temporary, but blisters, well, blisters are forever. Like you will have those scars.
Exactly.
But the big twist is the Joint Allied Parade doesn't happen.
No, after all that.
Yeah, exactly. After all that, something does happen, which we'll talk about in a second, clearly. But yeah, exactly, the bigger, and I'm not talking about the brigade thing. That's now delegated to history. But there was this aspiration to have, a fairly sizable parade, one parade with the different allied nations and Soviets included, and that was canceled. And as I said, I looked through the archives. There's probably a document out there explaining exactly why. I didn't find it, but what I did find was some people saying that they weren't, when I say some people, I mean some of the Canadians, quote unquote, for unknown reasons, it was canceled. I think we could probably speculate as to what some of these reasons were. And a decision is made to shift to separate parades, a parade per allied force, if I can put it that way. There's going to be a British parade, there's an American parade, and a Russian Soviet parade. And so that in itself, we're talking about symbolism a lot here. So now you have three. So each one, I can kind of see like, okay, some people, frankly, are probably quite relieved, not just from a pragmatic perspective, but now this is the British parade. Everyone knows this is the British parade. The Americans, this is us, so I can kind of see what's happening. And then each one of these three is staged, the respective representative. It sounds like there's scaffolding and some seats lined on the street, and so the VIPs were shipped in, and there's a lot of people watching. But indeed, yeah, there are now three parades.
I suspect it had something to do with the pace of march. I think there was disagreement on the 120. So
chaos.
No, but I think it's sorry, just to cut you off there, Rejoy. I think it's a bit of a symptom of what you were talking about earlier there, Stephen, is that the Cold War was already starting here.
Yes.
Probably,
Yes.
Russians don't want to play nice. Brits and the Americans are getting fed up with that kind of stuff. And so, here we are 2 months after the end of the war, and whoops, already can't even get together for a parade.
Yeah, well, we're not going to compromise anymore. We're just go do your own thing then.
Yeah.
So this means that the Canadians march with the British alongside the famous 7th Armored Division.
Yeah, the Desert Rats, who people will know in various ways through studying, through lore, through Montgomery's own writing about it. But so
his own memoirs.
No, exactly. So this is, it's hard to, the politicians notwithstanding, and obviously Eisenhower is in the mix here, but from a Canadian perspective, he wasn't universally beloved, I suspect, but Montgomery, knowing that Montgomery is there, and we're not just there, but we're now actively part of his parade, would have been fear-inducing, maybe pride. I'm not sure, but we are now marching with the British and them in particular.
So just before you give us the numbers and the route, here's a quick RMR story, of course, about Montgomery. When he was trying to rehabilitate or cement his image after the war, he was doing a Canadian tour. And at one point he came through Montreal and said, "Can you visit the RMR?" And part of the inspection and all this, they're going to have a lunch afterwards served in the Warrant Officers and Sergeants Mess. And Montgomery had famously given an order during the Normandy campaign that there wasn't going to be a reinforcement or resupply of rations. And he said that the reason that the troops were issued chewing gum is that they would keep them going for another 24 hours. So he was ordering one more big push, and the troops were obviously not too pleased about not getting their rations for this. And so apparently at that dinner in, after World War II, when Montgomery sat down, plate was put on him. There was 2 pieces of chewing gum on the plate.
Oh, fantastic.
So
What a great
the troops
story.
remembered.
well,
there's
exactly.
no
They say
discussion
long
if he was
memory.
amused or not.
Well,
So,
hey, that's a great story.
Stephen, can you give us the numbers and the route that the British and Canadians did for the parade?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to try and Rejoy, you've been very helpful. I'm going to try and paint a kind of geographic picture with words. Again, if people who've been in Berlin, even if you haven't, you've probably seen the Brandenburger Tor, the gate, and the Ziegersäule. So keeping in mind that that's not strictly speaking, but those are kind of the one is the terminus or one's the start of the parade, the Ziegersäule, and the other one, the Brandenburg Gate, is the terminus of the parade, and it's just about 2 kilometers long. And fun fact, in 2006, when Germany hosted the World Cup, and Berlin had one of the things, that's where the fan mile was.
Yes.
So I was there as a younger, not necessarily younger lad, with my family, kicking around soccer balls, not knowing this story for reasons we've talked about. I had no idea that this was the case. I've been on that road kicking soccer balls and buying incredibly overpriced, terrible beer. But that's the same road. So if you can kind of think of how the chairs would have been set up and so on. So there's about 10,000 troops all told. And we're talking about the parade the Canadians are in here. And you're cranking out all the kit, all the hardware. You've got tanks, armored cars, self-propelled and tractor drawn guns. As I say, it's about 2 kilometers long. So they would have been forming up presumably behind the Ziegersäule, and then as they started to move, they would here I don't know if anyone can see what my hands are doing, but it's a direct line. It's a road basically made for this kind of thing. And so, as I say, it's about 2 kilometers long.
So no subtlety here. It's 2 kilometers of message delivered at a brisk pace.
Because 10,000 dudes lined up, especially if they're in column of 3, which I think
and with armor.
Correct is, that would take up 2 kilometers easily. There's not even a marching at that point. So walk us through the VIP procession before the march.
Yeah.
This is interesting.
So there's a pre-parade ceremony which had a lot of VIPs on different trucks. There was, from the looks of it, there was 50 dignitaries on 8 half trucks, and the first half truck carried the top 4 figures. So this is the first thing that anyone would see. And you're trotting out the greatest hits here. You've got Churchill, you've got Alan Brooke, you've got Field Marshal Montgomery, as we were talking about, and General Lewis Lynn. So you've got big characters in almost any definition of that at the front, and then the other kind of half tracks come along. So the front end of the parade is the political. And then you have Russian and Soviet representatives on some of these vehicles. You have French representatives on some of these vehicles. So it's the politicians who come first, and then the military are going to be coming later. And I don't know if this is a spoiler alert or shocking or not. There's no Canadian senior representation on these. From a political point of view, there's no Canadian arm in arm. It's kind of like the F1 parade of drivers at the beginning of it. You're kind of arm in arm with Lewis Hamilton. There are no Canadians at the front end of that. And I didn't drill into that. I think we could probably speculate as to why that was the case. But you get the VIPs to begin, and then the military comes behind.
So you have the Russians and the French, but no Canadian VIPs.
Yeah. I think in some ways this might be making a virtue out of a necessity. The fact that there were no politicians from Canada immediately puts the focus on the Canadian soldiers, like from a Canadian media perspective, in other words. So
Right.
Mackenzie King didn't, kind of soak up the media attention to the extent he ever did. So from a Canadian perspective, our only and very important involvement in there are the boots on the ground of the Canadian officers and other ranks.
Yeah, Monty also was not a big fan of Canadian generals. There was no love between them. He would have fired all of them if he'd had a chance and replaced them all with Brits. He did try that. Of course, we have to mention the RMR's Major General C.D. Price, who had been a division commander who had been fired by Monty, retired early, like a bunch of them. So I could see why, if Monty's fingers are on this, I would understand why there's no military VIPs there. Yeah. So the march itself, the march past, begins at 10 o'clock sharp?
Yeah, from all accounts, it was, unlike our German friends who were hungover, I think this one actually did start on time, plus or minus, but I'm sure it was happening fairly quickly. Among other things, as you guys both said, you just have a lot of people to move through. So come on, lads, let's get going. And so it starts at around 10 a.m. And the units were marching at 6 abreast. And there's one quote in here: "Speedy succession." Was the efficiency rate. Now, it doesn't talk about 120 or this, that, or the other. We know the Canadians are doing, and presumably that was lockstep with the other people, because otherwise it would just be a mess. But you have them starting to now move through, and you have 4 bands in total. And then that includes the bespoke Canadian Berlin Battalion pipe band, which was pulled together. In fact, the pipe band of the Canadians, the pipe band marches first, with the rest of the battalion, if I can put it that way, coming right behind.
Oh, the pipe band. I mean, that really sends sort of chills down your spine, much like listening to Newton, my controversial cat, expressing his opinions. I mean, the sound is very similar, but in this case,
caterwauling,
the caterwauling of the pipes.
The skirl, I believe, is the term they prefer.
The
stirs the heart.
The skirl echoing off the ruined facades. It's hard not to get the chills, and not just because it's haunting, but also just the sound of it all.
Yeah, well, exactly. And if just briefly, when I was talking about the Canadians in Iceland, the deployment there, one of the things that stood out to me when I was reading about the Icelandic perspective of the Canadians is, and I don't speak Icelandic, but they had an expression for the men in the funny hats and skirts. So Highland Regiment, I speak as a proud Scottish Canadian and so on, and you guys know this better than I. But yeah, you get the pipes, and you can really get some people fired up. It's also kind of a diplomatic or not so diplomatic middle finger to some of the Germans who, because these are the pipes, by the way.
Yes.
So mass pipe band is not so in any way.
There's no hiding that in any way, shape, or form. They're coming for you. And so the pipe band was, and I was just looking, I had an article somewhere, I forgot what it was, but I talked about the local media. The Hamilton Spectator had an article, and the headline was "Local Piper is in the band." And so again, just back home, this was very well known, and very a lot of the people were very proud, and the piper in particular was flagged in one of many articles, because he was representing not just the Argylls but also Hamilton, and is a piper, so people were extremely proud about this.
Right. And talking about the press and the media, they were everywhere, right?
They were, and I got this picture, if you will, like in my head, and then I saw some other subsequent, like they're, we talked about the paparazzi. Maybe don't hear that expression much these days. I don't know, but they were like literally hanging off trees, and climbing up light standards and trying to get shots, and they had video. Obviously, this isn't antediluvian times. This is they had obviously reels and radio, and so the media, from what I could tell, are there in force. Not surprisingly, given who's there and the reason it's there. And there were some accounts. Matthew Halton references, photographers competing with each other. Talk about elbows up, like they were trying to get the spots right to get the shot to send it back home. So yeah, they were hanging off trees, sitting on back of their own trucks, lying on their backs to kind of get either the perfect shot, or that was the only place they could go. So it was needless to say, it was very well observed in terms of numbers of people actually there, and then through the media, is amplified through the media to the respective domestic, through newsreel and radio and photographer and obviously print.
So this tradition that we know of, the paparazzi nearly getting themselves killed to get the right shot, that's nothing new. That started way back then, eh?
Well, exactly. You want to know it. This isn't breaking news in the sense like what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So you get there, and you try and get your shot because people do want to see this. Again, for a little bit of context, things are still happening in the Pacific Theater. Obviously, in July 45, that hasn't come to its conclusion yet. So the war is very much, for a million obvious reasons, very much still present in the minds of lots of people, not least of which because their brothers or their sons or their fathers are still overseas if you're a Canadian. And obviously, as we've 17,000 and plus are never coming home in terms of active force. So the war was still, it was technically over from a political military perspective, but I think it was very, very much, how could it not be? It was still very much in the public ethos, and the media were there to show that. And also, it's competitive being in media. They want to get the shot. They want to get paid. They want to get the shot, right? Because these guys are, as we said, they're moving by in a pretty fast clip. And if your head is down, fumbling with the camera, and you're
you're gonna miss it. You're gonna miss it.
Yeah. So, and speaking of being over quickly, it starts 10 o'clock and it's all over by 10 after 11, right?
She's all done in just over an hour. Yeah, and that's from top to tail. So you talked about speedy succession, and they would have moved quite quickly, as you would expect, as military parades. I imagine some are slower than others, but yeah, this went by pretty quickly, and the symbolism was evident in every second. So they didn't have to drag it out for 3 or 4 hours to really sink the message in. I think that was pretty clear from the get-go, and this was just a function of logistics almost. You have that many people. It's just, as you say, even 6 abreast. It's going to take some time to move everybody through.
But what really struck me as interesting in your article, Stephen, you mentioned that the German civilians cheered Churchill.
They did, and we talked off the top about the Germans, and if you're going to keep talking about RMR, I'm going to keep talking about McGill, because
there you go.
When
That's fair.
When I was, is that a fair? So when I was one of my,
they're both important to me, so it works for me.
Yes, sir. Yeah, you're the combination here. So Professor Dr. Herr Peter Hoffman at the time, and I simply say that because he was a world-renowned expert.
Yes.
Yeah?
I professor. I was in his German history class. Yes,
terrified me. But only because I was a young guy. I just and my point simply is he was a specialist on German resistance to the Nazis. So, and as I married into a German family, as I discovered myself, I guess I kind of knew that. There were millions and millions and millions of Germans who had nothing to do with the Nazi Party, who were oppressed by them. And I'm not making apologies for anybody. This is a loaded thing, I realize. I'm simply trying to say that there were some Germans who many Germans, who celebrated the end of the war. They didn't know what was going to be coming, but it sure as hell couldn't be as bad as what they had survived as Germans in their own country. So I think in that sense, and also, let's face it, the bullets were no longer flying, artillery shells weren't happening, they weren't being bombed from the air, so it was quite literally safe to be outside. And so you see hundreds out here and cheering for Churchill in particular. Now, as I say, we're only talking about the British parade. I haven't looked at the other parades. I can't imagine many Germans were cheering on Zhukov, but thanks. Thanks for that. But Churchill was literally an iconic figure. And there's one United Press correspondent, Ronald Clark, who said he called it, quote, the strangest thing I'd ever seen since D-Day. And I think by strangest, he means it was a spectacle in every way. But Rejoy, to your point, I think the strange part that really hit him, if I read his piece correctly, was this very fact that Germans, they weren't just there, well, let me put it in the positive. They're literally cheering him. Like, it was very active and vocal. And I think that says a lot about many things. Yeah. But the funny thing, if funny is the word, is Churchill, he gone. When the parade is over, he takes off and he goes to speak for the troops. There's something called, the Winston Club, which was his, Colin, your story about Monty and so on, these guys had amazing stories to tell.
Mhm.
And he went off and had a little chat once the parade was done. Because when it was done, it's done. Like, there's no need to hang about.
Right.
So he goes to this thing called the Winston Club, which I thought was kind of funny.
That's pretty cool. And so, as you said, when it's done, it's done. So after which, the Canadians, they head back to their barracks. Their main duty has been fulfilled. And now it's time for our last fantasy sponsor break. Because
Indeed. Well, we have to. We have to.
absolutely.
This episode is also not brought to you by Soviet Curfew Vodka, the spirit of Berlin nightlife, best enjoyed in the narrow window between Harmless Wander and Why is that checkpoint looking at us?
Distilled from potatoes, Lend-Lease diesel, optimism, and the last known reserves of We'll Be Fine.
Crisp, crisp finish, slight aftertaste of administrative consequences.
Perfect for celebrating victory, making new friends, stealing watches, and learning that just one more is how you end up explaining yourself to someone with a very serious hat.
Soviet Curfew Vodka, for when the war is over, but your bedtime is still enforced.
Champagne, vodka, and so on. This is. I love your sponsors. They're fantastic.
so do us.
Yeah, very
Really?
boozy, very boozy.
Yeah,
So now we're wrapping it up.
we're coming to a close. Yeah.
We're coming to a close. Stephen, what happens in the days after? What does life look like for a unit whose job was essentially one single public moment?
Yeah, exactly. One and done. They were all given the day off afterwards. I can't suggest the parade was rigorous from a physical perspective, but as you guys were talking about, there would have been planning and also
the
just the
preparation
inherent
would
sense
suck.
of relief. And as a thank you, maybe if that's the word, to say that, the day off, and maybe they play baseball again the next day. I'm not sure, because
Probably wasn't
they did win
a
one
big
and one.
club scene going on, and probably wasn't a lot to see in Berlin.
No, exactly. So, what is it? That's a very good point. Like, there literally is not much to do. So there's a short wind down period. There's packing up and preparing to part to leave, and they do leave on 27 July. So actually they did stick around for a little bit, and then just as the Germans, Berliners in particular, were there to cheer on Churchill, many Berliners came to applaud and clap the Canadians out of the theater, as it were. So, and there's another quote I read somewhere. It was referred to as an elderly German observer. I don't honestly know if this person, male or female. That's the way it was written in the article. It simply said, "Canadians, good," was the quote. And that really struck me. You put yourself in the position of this elderly German observer, whoever that may have been, and the visual of that. In some ways, they might have regretted the fact that the Canadians were leaving because can't you help us with whatever comes next? But nonetheless, job done. The battalion heads back to the Netherlands, which is then a step towards their eventual
Repatriation back home.
repatriation back to Canada.
Yeah, good. Canadians, good. I mean, that's a small line that carries a lot of weight.
I love it. Yeah,
it's also so Canadian. It's very Canadian, isn't it? Leave quietly, get a gentle compliment on the way out. Job done, no fanfare. That's it.
No, exactly. So, I don't know if the troops themselves heard these comments, but they would have been aware, obviously, that it was generally a supportive environment. You would know if the people lining it were hostile to you, and clearly they weren't. So, the Canadians, as we said, is a composite battalion, the people from different parts of the country. And there's someone in the Fusiliers diary, I apologize, said, quote, "It was the best adventure I've ever had."
Yeah, that's quite understandable, isn't it? I mean, Berlin may be a ruined city, but it's still a city. It's a novelty, distraction, and this is the end goal. This is where you were supposed to end up. So I can well see, a Fusilier just scribbling in his diary, "It is the best adventure I've ever had."
Well, exactly. You're not under fire. You're not you're at the front line, but in a different kind of front line. That no one is shooting at you. And the war is over. Big caps, New York Times, war is over. Again, that comes with a lot of problems. In fact, some of the Canadians got into a bit of a scrape with locals and wound up in a Soviet prison for being out too late and too drunk.
Wow.
No, they did. They were allowed back out. They weren't shipped off to Siberia. But there were things happening. And Colin, to your point earlier about the auguring in the Cold War, the Soviets were there for many, many reasons.
Yes.
And so it wasn't all, "Hey, this is fantastic, thanks." There were lots of undercurrents of issues. In fact, there was a book that was published just a month ago about Berlin in 1939 to 1940. So 1 month ago, another book written about this exact same era. In other words, the time and the efforts and the challenges and everything that was going on, it's still very much alive to historians and to people. And if you go to Berlin today, of course, you can see some of this. So this story may have been in the shade from a Canadian War narrative point of view, but the story itself in post-Berlin obviously is extremely historic, and especially what happens over the coming years.
Yeah. It's, the senior leaders at the time, of course, were having to do that grim homework now of victory at Potsdam, right? You alluded quite rightfully so that it didn't seem to be at the end of World War I that there was much of a plan for dealing with the peace. And now, but there was here, and the grim homework is being done. Can you tell us a little bit about Potsdam Conference? What was going on?
Yeah, so they again, the Allied leaders, but the Soviets are kind of figuring out what does now that Germany has been well and truly defeated. Again, Japan has not yet in terms of July at least, but from a European theater perspective, they're in Potsdam. And if you ever go to Potsdam, just by the way, the room that they met in and so on, the room where it happens, as it were, it's still very much there. You can see it's an incredible living museum. We can see where people sat. You can see where the chairs were set up. You can see where Stalin's rooms were, and where allegedly they had the bugs so they could hear what
I
the
was just
Allies
going
were
to say.
talking about. Oh yeah, no,
Yeah.
I can imagine. You can almost literally smell the smoke that inevitably everybody smoked. Who
Yeah.
knows? But it was very so. What was happening in Potsdam was as consequential as you can imagine, for many different reasons. Not least of which is it's the posturing.
Yeah.
And there obviously have been Allied conferences throughout the war that are happening. This one comes at the end, and they're figuring out like who gets what, if I can be a bit colloquial.
Yeah.
And there's an incredible statecraft that's well, I shouldn't call it incredible, but their statecraft is kind of happening in the moment. All the while, there's also United Nations conversations, or what became the United Nations, are happening. And then, of course, Canada becomes, I'm skipping ahead a little bit maybe, but becomes one of the signatories of what becomes NATO. So there's an awful lot happening. And then back in the Canadian context, we talked about the Cold War. Well, on 5 September 1945, a lot of people will know about the Guzenko affair, and a Soviet civil servant working in Ottawa defected and took with him 109 documents, which he just stuffed in a bag and under his arm, from what I can tell. And he walked, I think he walked into the offices of the Ottawa Journal or Ottawa Citizen, one of the local papers, and said, "Hey, I got a story for you." So, so the Cold War is on. I don't think they called it that at the time. That's an appellation we'd give afterwards. But things are happening, and people are very much aware that this is happening, because they know that Uncle Joe Stalin is it is a brand new game.
Yeah.
And this Guzenko thing happens only 46 days after the Berlin parade. So in other words,
It's
Jack,
very raw. Very raw.
But and Jack Granstein has a great line that I quoted. I can't remember the exact, but he said, like, Guzenko took the first steps of what became the Cold War. And not only was it happening shortly after the Berlin thing, but also steps. He literally talks. So it is literally marching through history, metaphorically and physically. So Potsdam is happening, and then of course, some people may not know, Churchill lost the election.
Yes.
So he, all right, chaps, I'm off, and just leaves halfway through or partway through Potsdam. So things are happening while these Canadians we've talked about, they're just at this point desperate, just like the soldiers. They just want to get home.
That's right.
Yeah. So as the battalion marches off into the sunset, victory, Berlin has become the new epicenter of a new world, a new war, so to speak, already starting to sort of take place, isn't it? Like this is the birth of the Cold War.
It's ground zero for that kind of thing, because then in 46, 47, 48, you're going to get the Berlin airlift, and Berlin, and then of course, obviously, the wall comes up in the early 60s.
Yeah.
And just a interesting point of personal connection back to where I started with the story. My wife's cousins who live in Germany, their back fence was literally the wall. They're on the western side. Their back fence was literally the wall. And the guy, the Klaus, I mentioned him, he's the wonderful guy who took me around. He was born in that house. So he was born and raised in a house where the wall was there. And then one day in 1990, because it took him a little while because in 89 it fell, but physically, it takes time to take down the entire wall.
Yeah.
They happened to be home with one of their kids who was sick, and they saw the tractor come and take down the wall, and they could now see their neighbor across the divide for the first time in 35 years.
Holy crap.
Well, speaking about the
So,
wall, there's a little funny story. Sorry to interrupt, but funny
no,
story from my side. So, my wife Aisha was studying at Smith College at the time, and she did her junior year abroad in Hamburg, and so she was there in Germany when the wall was coming down,
oh
and
wow,
so she and a group of German students got into a car and drove out to Berlin and watched the wall come down.
Oh, wow.
And her story is, she said how when they got there, because there were all these pictures on German media of people climbing the wall,
yeah,
and pulling, East Germans up and West Germans up and all that. But the time they got there was nobody on the wall, so they wanted to figure out what was going on, and they formed a pyramid. Now, Aisha was the smallest of, as you can imagine, of all the German students. So they decided they'd form a pyramid, and the lightest person would go up onto the wall, and
yeah,
that was her.
That would
And so
definitely be her.
that
wow,
would, and as Colin well knows, the spirit is very much there. And so she got up on the wall, and for a time, she was the only person standing on the wall as
that's
she took a look
extraordinary.
around. So
Yeah.
that's a story that's worth telling. Quite
That's
amazing.
amazing. Yeah, no, thank you for telling me that. Yeah, it's Berlin. I find is an incredible city in many different ways. And this is, I was just trying to give light to one one story. And so I think I mentioned off the top about the Allied Museum of Berlin. I kind of went there, and
Yeah.
when I was researching this article a couple years ago, emailed their curator and to say, hey, do you have anything on Canada? And just why not? And I got an email back to say, dear Stephen, I'm sorry, there's no papers here. Papers, please. There are no papers. And I think he quoted me something as a blind spot we haven't researched yet. So just in advance of this call I'm doing with you guys today, I thought, well, maybe a couple of years later, let's see what happens. So I did a search. I'm on the Alerton Museum. I typed in Canada, and it came up, sorry, nothing matched your search terms.
Aw.
So, so maybe I should, advocate for this story a little
Or
bit more. And again, I'm not pointing fingers. It's not a surprise given how
no,
the
but
sheer numbers of British and
sure,
Americans and
sure.
French and everything else.
Or
But
maybe
this little stories,
maybe type in RMR.
you have found 5 things. Yeah, exactly. I would be all right. I'm going to do that after this call. You'll
Well
be the
played,
first to
Rejoy.
know.
Well played.
I wouldn't have high hopes, but
Hey,
I'll let you know.
never know.
Maybe McGill's in there. Who knows?
Sure.
Oh dear. So then that's the battalion marched through Berlin, and then history did what history does. Filed it under. We'll get back to that.
Well, and I think the symbolism is still there. And again, I don't want to overplay the parade itself, but I think it was a signature moment. And it does speak to some of the themes we're talking about here in terms of participation. Participation is influence, even though we weren't in Potsdam. But if you're there, that gives you some capacity to be involved and maybe even shape some things, or at least let people know that, hey, yeah, we were there. And so that's where I kind of come back to the past, present, and future. Like, we were there in Dieppe, the Fusiliers and so on. We are here today in
Mhm.
Berlin in July
Yes.
45, and we will be there tomorrow, not knowing what tomorrow might be.
Yeah, one of the great stories about, just to connect Canadians, Berlin, and Churchill is allegedly Churchill had said once in an offhand manner that he knew he could always take Berlin because everyone's concerned with the race in 44, the race to Berlin, who's going to take it first. And he said he knew he could take Berlin at any time just by issuing every Canadian soldier a bottle of rum and a 48-hour pass and telling them that Berlin was off limits.
So the first place they would go. Yeah.
Exactly. Stephen, thank you so much for bringing us to life and for giving us a Canadian story that's part of, it's part symbolism, it's part logistics, and part, how is this not more widely known?
Yeah.
Well, maybe we should tell the museum but maybe we should send them a Canadian flag or something.
There we go. And for listeners, the Canadian Berlin Battalion didn't fight in Berlin. It marched in Berlin. So Canada's role couldn't be politely overlooked.
Indeed. And we'll be back soon with more military history, more human stories, and more proof that the most terrifying force in any army is a clipboard with authority.
That's right. And don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment, share with your friends, and heck, be bold. Enough with this share on your favorite social media channel, who amongst our fans is going to get the first Rum Ration podcast tattoo?
That's commitment.
Okay, it won't be Rejoy or me, but we support anyone who wants to, anyone who's embarked on the
You go
journey
for
of
it, yeah.
self-discovery.
Indeed. And until next time, cheers to history.
Cheers to history.
Thanks, guys.